Everybody else did it, but you guys wanted more, so I put a different twist on it. The i5-11400, 10 games tested on 4 different graphics cards. Let's do this. Hey guys, welcome to Elevated Systems. I'm your host CJ, and a couple of weeks ago I tested the internal graphics of this 11th gen Intel i5-11400, and I plan to follow up with a full benchmark review of the CPU, but several other channels beat me to it, so I figured, one less video on the production schedule. But I reached out to you guys in a community poll, and y'all overwhelmingly said, theirs were good, but you should still do it. So I'm doing it, but not exactly as I planned. Instead of doing the standard CPU review, building a bottleneck-free test bench, and testing the 11400 against other CPUs, I decided since the i5-11400 is kind of the new go-to sub $200 gaming CPU, I'd pair it with a more price-appropriate GPU to test, and I polled the audience again on which graphics card to use, and of course, you asked for all of them. And to be clear, these are all the GPUs I own. I don't have any current gen GPUs because, just like most of you, I'm not paying scalper prices. So the plan is to test the i5-11400's performance as a gaming CPU for 10 different games on each of those 4 graphics cards, which should do 2 things. First, we'll be able to see the GPU scaling of the 11400, and second, there's enough of a cross-section of last-gen graphics here that if you have an older GPU that you can't replace right now, but are looking to maybe upgrade your system to an 11th gen Intel in the meantime, these results should help you figure out where that new system with the older GPU will perform. I also ran some productivity benchmarks on the 11400 paired with my RTX 2080 Ti and compared them to the Ryzen 3600X, 3700X, and 5600X. Anyway, the agenda today is to first build out a new test bench for the 11400 with a B560 foundation. Then I can take you through all the benchmarks, and finally I'll finish up with my thoughts on what type of build this CPU best fits into.
The test bench was built on the Asus ROG Strix B560A gaming Wi-Fi. This motherboard has a ton of features for the price. The most significant for our purposes today is the ability to completely remove the CPU power and boost time limits, which I will be doing for all testing. The boot drive is a Samsung 960 EVO NVMe SSD. Additionally, Enermax just sent me a box of stuff to check out, and although they are not a sponsor of this video, I am using their LickMax 3 240mm AIO to cool the 11400. I installed 32 gigabytes of G.Skill Trident Z 3200 MHz CL16 memory, and I'm powering the test bench with Enermax's new Marble Bronze 750 watt 80 plus bronze rated power supply. Test bench is ready. Let's look at those benchmarks. Starting with raw CPU performance, again, I tested the i5-11400, represented by the purple line, against the Ryzen 3600X, 3700X, and 5600X. In the V-Ray render test, we see the 11400 gets about a 6.3% bump over the Ryzen 3600X, while falling a bit short of the significantly faster 5600X and the larger 8-core 3700X. We also see the 11400 has a faster single core score than both the 3600X and 3700X, but falls behind the 5600X by about 10%. The Cinebench R20 scores mimic the V-Ray scores, but with tighter margins. Next, I tested the Adobe suite using the Puget Bench benchmarking utilities. Starting with Photoshop, which is the most single-core dependent of the apps, the 11400 pulls ahead of both the 3600 and 3700X, while the super-fast 5600X takes a 15% lead. After Effects uses both single-core operations as well as multi-core functions, and here we see the 11400 fall just between the 3600X and 3700X, with the 5600X again pulling far ahead. Finally, in our video editing, Premiere Pro, the most multi-threaded program, sees the 11400 practically tied with the 3600X, with the only 8-core CPU taking the lead. In the 3 Blender tests I ran, on average, the 11400 is virtually tied with the 3600X and comes in about 14% slower than the 5600X and 23% slower than the 3700X. The Passmark CPU performance test combines single-core and multi-threaded tests, and we see the 11400 comes in last, but just by less than 1% behind the 3600X. PC Mark 10 tests the system's ability to do a range of common computing tasks in real-world scenarios. Home office tasks, web browsing, video conferencing, video streaming, some light photo and video editing, as well as light 3D render performance. I used this benchmarking tool to demonstrate that for these very light, bursty, single-threaded operations, which is what 85% of all PC users use a PC for, you typically don't see any noticeable performance difference with modern CPUs. That's reflected here with only a 3.4% gap between the highest and lowest score. Moving on to gaming, and again, here all tests are with the i5-11400 paired with a RTX 2080 Ti in purple, the Radeon RX 5700 in green, the GTX 1660 in red, and the RX 580 4GB in blue. And yes, I'm aware of the irony of the color assignments. Again, we're looking at 2 things here: how well the CPU performance scales with GPU power, and second, to give you a range of scores where you should be able to figure out where your GPU would fit in paired with the i5-11400. So we're starting with the synthetics, and we get the best view of scaling with the time spy scores, with gains of 30% from the RX 580 to the GTX 1660, 44% gain stepping up to the RX 5700, and another 49% gain stepping up to the RTX 2080 Ti. Firestrike has always been a very AMD GPU friendly test, and we see that here with the RX 580 and GTX 1660 practically tied, with the RX 2080 Ti scoring only 19% higher than the RX 5700. I ran superposition at the 1080p extreme setting, and you see that the lower tier cards struggled a bit with this test. For actual gaming benchmarks, I picked games using DX11, DX12, and Vulkan APIs. Some CPU bound, some GPU bound, some balanced, but mostly I picked games with built-in benchmarks so you can run the exact benchmark for comparison. However, I captured the results with MSI Afterburner and Rivatuna stats rather than the actual benchmarking results, so I could get 1% lows. All benchmarks were run at 1080p with ultimate graphical presets selected. And first up, we see Assassin's Creed Odyssey, which is the most CPU bound title tested. And here we do see a 40% gain from the 580 to the 1660. Those gains drop off to 26%, stepping up to the RX 5700, and then only 8% gain with the 2080 Ti as the CPU struggles to keep up as the GPU power increases. However, the rest of the titles on the slide are more GPU bound, so the CPU has no problems keeping up. In our next group of games, one note is to put a higher load on the CPU. I ran Red Dead Redemption 2 at the balanced preset with the slider line right in the middle, and even with the added CPU demand, the performance still scaled well. The same goes for Shadow of the Tomb Raider, which leans more CPU demanding. Running at very high, it also scaled well as the CPU kept up with the frame time. Finally, I added Outriders to my benchmark suite at the last minute. I have pretty much zero experience with this game, however, it performed pretty much identically to Tomb Raider. Finally, these are the averages of our average frame rates for all 10 games tested, and from the RX 580 to the GTX 1660, there is a 31% gain, another 34% when stepping up to the RX 5700, and also 34% up to the RTX 2080 Ti. So we do just start to see some, not a lot, but some CPU bottlenecking of the i5-11400 as our scaling tightens as we get up to the RTX 2080 Ti.
All right, guys, my conclusion is going to be based on mainly my testing, the data I just covered, but I'll also be drawing on testing done by other reviewers when it comes to the 11400's gaming potential, specifically how it compares to other CPUs, and specifically the testing done by Gamers Nexus, Hardware Unboxed, and Optimum Tech. If you haven't checked out those review videos, be sure to do so after this one. Okay, the CPU. Let's begin with productivity, which of course is a broad term. If you use your computer for anything other than gaming, home office, content creation, coding, whatever, then for the money, the i5-11400 is a good option. But let's get more specific. If all you really do is home office or schoolwork using the MS Office 365 apps, do some video conferencing, web browsing, some streaming music or video, then the 11400 is really your only option here because it's the only one with internal graphics that can do all of that without the need of dedicated graphics card. Check out my last video on the 11400 for more about the internal graphics. If you're more into 2D content creation, Photoshop, or video editing, then while the Ryzen 5 5600 will give you about a 15% uplift in those areas, it does it at about a 60% price increase. And that's if you can find it at MSRP. Last week you could, this week, not so much. Now, if your content creation is more 3D focused, while the 11400 will handle that workload, you're definitely going to benefit from more cores and better multi-threaded performance. So this is where I'd spend the extra money on an 8 or more core processor. Now, for gaming, I'm just going to agree with what the other reviewers I mentioned earlier said about the i5-11400, and I'm going to raise them all and say that the i5-11400 is the best price to performance gaming CPU available today. The Ryzen 5 3600 has to this point been universally accepted, including by me, as the best price to performance gaming CPU available. And this CPU outperforms it in gaming and is cheaper. You just can't argue with those facts, but many will surely try. You'll also get some small performance uplifts with the other 11th gen i5s, the 11500 and the 11600 and 600K, but the very minimal gains from the slightly higher clocks isn't worth the added cost in my opinion. Now, as far as my testing, the 11400 scales very well when paired with progressively better GPUs, and if you look at the other testing out there, it continues to scale with current gen GPUs like the RTX 3080 and even the 3090. So back to my initial hypothesis. I think it's safe to say that if you have an older system with an older graphics card, upgrading to an i5-11400 system paired with your older graphics card will definitely provide some performance improvement. Now, while this CPU does scale very well, and going with it will allow you to save money on the CPU, which you can then apply to a better GPU, there's a point where the price point just gets kind of out of balance. A $184 CPU paired with a $6,000 to $1,000 plus graphics card, not the best option. So where I think this CPU's top end fit for a gaming PC is paired with an RTX 3060 Ti if you play for Team Green, or an RX 6700 XT for Team Red. These GPUs should give you gaming performance somewhere between the RX 5700 and RTX 2080 Ti from the benchmark charts I just showed, closer to the 2080 Ti. So to cap this off, I think I should just reiterate what I already said. The Intel i5-11400 is the best price to performance gaming CPU on the market today. And that's it. Links to everything are in the description below. Like, comment, subscribe. Hope to see you in the next one.